All right. Good morning, everyone. So, hope you're having a good Sunday so far and enjoying your weekend. Good to be with you on another weekend. I know this is not a Wednesday night. Okay. So, you're watching the right video. This is Sunday morning and all that, as long as you're watching on Sunday, I guess. But I'm back teaching on this Sunday, and as I've done in the previous Sunday lessons I've been doing the past few, we've been talking through the topic of trusting God, right? And kind of just looking at some passages concerning that topic. And again, I'm sure you can see the relevance of that, especially right now. I mean, that's always applicable. That's always something we're going to be dealing with, is trusting God, especially in life's difficulties and when things are hard. And so this is applicable not just now, but even throughout all life, but especially right now, right? And so we're continuing that topic today, right? Where we're going to be looking at the book of Habakkuk. All right. So maybe a book you're somewhat familiar with. Cody taught through it like a few years back and stuff. So maybe you kind of remember that. If not, it's all good. We're going to go through now. But it is a great book, right? Great book to go through, and especially on this topic of kind of trusting God and really embracing God's will and stuff. And that's really what Habakkuk is all about, okay? And so as we go through this, originally I was thinking about, and you might be wondering, well, what passage of Habakkuk we're in? We're going to do all of it, okay? So we're actually going to try to cover the whole book of Habakkuk today, this morning, right now, right? So, and don't worry, this is going to be like 2 hours or an hour, and we're just kind of getting an overview of it. And that's because originally, like, I was thinking about just teaching like the last kind of section or so, last few verses. But even to grasp the beauty of those verses, I think you really need to understand the context of what came before that, like in the beginning of Habakkuk and all throughout it, right? Because I think that makes those last verses so much more powerful, and it really helps us understand those better, okay? And so at that point then I was kind of like, well, why don't we just walk through the whole book together, right? And get the big picture of it. Because there's even stuff that along the way that we're going to point out that's super applicable as well. So that's why we're going to actually do the whole book of Habakkuk, all right? So, and I think the title of the lesson or on the video, right, is like Embracing God's Will, Lessons from Habakkuk, right? Like, that's what we're going to be looking at. How, like, and we have Habakkuk's example of embracing God's will, even when it's difficult, even when it's hard, but trusting God in the midst of difficult times. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. All right. So kind of the structure of Habakkuk, for those who aren't familiar with it, which again, kind of might be a random book, so you might not be too familiar. Really, it's kind of structured like almost like a Q&A, right? Like a question and answer format. And it's this question and answer format between Habakkuk and God, right? Like where Habakkuk asks these questions to the Lord, and the Lord actually responds. And there's kind of this back and forth a little bit, which on the surface, that's awesome, right? Like that'd be pretty cool to be in that situation, being able to like get those direct answers from God and everything. And so that's really the structure. And so really it goes back and forth like a couple times, where the structure of this, right, is like Habakkuk asks a question, the Lord answers. Habakkuk asks a follow-up question, the Lord answers again. And then the book closes with a prayer from Habakkuk, all right, kind of incorporating all of that, right, like his response to this Q&A essentially, okay? And so that's what's kind of the structure of Habakkuk, and that's how we're going to work through this, okay? And so let's get into this. We're going to read the first 4 verses, okay, where we see Habakkuk's first question, okay? And let's read it, and then we'll talk about what that question is, all right? So hopefully you have your Bibles, follow along. If you do, Habakkuk chapter 1, it says, "The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes perverted. All right, so that's those first 4 verses there, okay? And really that encapsulates Habakkuk's first question, right? Which is essentially asking God, like, hey, why aren't you doing anything? Okay? That's really what he's asking here, right? Essentially what is going on with Habakkuk, right? Like taking place in a very sinful time in Israel's history, right? During like the divided kingdom where a lot of wickedness is happening and all these things, right? And so essentially, right, Habakkuk is looking around the nation and he's just like, I just see sin everywhere, right? I see iniquity happening, people like being violent, not following the law, all these things. And he's wondering, like, God, why aren't you doing anything? Right? And it's so bad to the point where in verse 4 he says, right, so the law is paralyzed, right? Like the Mosaic law that God had given, it's like it's been like paralyzed because of the violence and wickedness of the people around them. Okay, and even says like injustice never goes forth, and so he's like, God, why aren't you doing anything? Right? Because like especially like in Israel at that time, like part of the law, you had like these blessings and curses of like, hey, if you follow the law, it's going to lead to blessing for the nation, for the people. But if you don't, if you disobey, it's going to lead to God's curses coming upon you, right? And God's judgment coming upon you. And so essentially, right, Habakkuk's looking at all this and like, God, why aren't you doing anything? Right? Like, why aren't you acting? Because these people are wicked. They're sinful. Why aren't you responding? Why, as it says, are you like just idly sitting by and kind of watching all this happen? And this is such a, I don't know, again, like this is where we're pointing out some of the applicable nature of this. We can find ourselves in this place a lot, right, in our lives, and even in our like nation today, and just things going on, right? Like we can be at this situation, right, where we can look at so many things that are sinful and wrong and wicked, and we can ask God, like, why aren't you doing anything? Why are you just kind of sitting by? And even not with like stuff with the nation, just even in our own lives where we might be praying to God to like act on our behalf, to do something to help us in some way. And we might be praying for a good thing. Like, for example, like maybe it's like you're praying for the salvation of a family member or a friend or something like that. And you're praying like, God, help. Like I need your help. I need you to intervene. And it seems like you're not doing anything. Right? And especially when we're praying for something that is like a good thing, right? We can wonder like, well, why wouldn't God act for this, right? Isn't this a good thing? Like, and so why is he not moving? Why is he not doing something about this? And it can be frustrating, right? It can be hard. And this is exactly the place that Habakkuk was in, right? This is exactly where Habakkuk was. He's just observing everything, and he's wondering, like, God, why aren't you doing anything? And so definitely a place that we can relate to, right? And probably a lot of you have maybe been at that place, or if not, like you probably will be at that place at some point, right? And so we see this is Habakkuk's first question. Okay, first question. He's just kind of getting right into it, right? Like as he addresses the Lord. And then we see in verses 5 through 11, God answers. Okay, God gives his response to this. All right, and he says in verse 5, picking up there, look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it. Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God. All right, so we have Habakkuk asking, hey, Lord, why aren't you doing anything? And the Lord's answer here in verses 5 through 11 is, I am doing something, right? I am doing something. And that's what we see in those verses, right? That God tells Habakkuk, right? Like, you think I'm sitting idle by? You think I'm not doing anything? Well, let me tell you what, like, I am doing something, right? I am doing something. In this particular case, what is God doing? He says, I am raising up a people, right? Specifically, he says the Chaldeans, right? Which is the Babylonians, all right? I am raising up the Chaldeans. I am raising up the Babylonians, essentially to accomplish my purposes, right? To essentially, what we're going to see, like, wipe out the nation of Israel, right? Like at this time, like Judah, the nation of Judah, okay? And so Habakkuk, right, is like seeing all the wickedness around him in the nation and stuff, and he's asking God, why aren't you doing anything? Why aren't you bringing judgment? And God is saying, oh, just wait. I'm raising up this nation to come and conquer, right? To bring you guys into exile, right? To bring judgment on the nation. It's coming, right? It might not look like it at this moment, but I am at work. I am raising up a people for my purposes, and judgment is coming, right? That's the reality, right? Judgment is coming. And so, and really, like, he talks about, like, they are strong and they are fierce people, and really, like, in your nation, right? Like, your nation, Habakkuk, like, they're not going to be able to stop them, right? Like, they're going to come and just kind of wipe you out. Okay. And so, and this is, again, a very applicable thing, because this probably wasn't what Habakkuk was expecting, right? I mean, that's actually part of, like, the curses of Deuteronomy and stuff, like, of being taken out from the land, okay? But I think Habakkuk probably wasn't expecting that, right? Because, again, that, like, being taken into exile, a nation being conquered, like, that doesn't just impact, like maybe the people who are disobedient, right? That impacts, like, everyone, okay? And so this is not probably what the answer Habakkuk was expecting. Maybe he expected God, like, is like, yeah, I'll just smite them down, like, I'll strike them down with some lightning and I'll deal with those wicked people, right? Like, but he says, right, like, hey, a nation's coming who's going to wipe you out, right? And that just shows, right, just the reality that God doesn't always answer our prayers in the way we would like. Or even just his plan, it might be different than what we would expect. Okay, and this is something that I think is really hard sometimes, and it's really hard to wrap our minds around it, especially when I feel like we're, again, asking for something maybe, like, good, right? Maybe we are asking for something that is good, or at least that we perceive is good, okay? But what we have to understand is sometimes when we think, God, you're not doing anything, you have to understand that sometimes, he is doing something. And that's reality. He's always doing something. He's never sitting idly by, just kind of like letting things pass him by, like, nah, I don't really feel like doing anything today, right? No, God is always at work. He is always doing something, okay? And a lot of times we just can't see it. Okay, we just can't always see it. And so what to us looks like inaction on God's part is actually him working and bringing his plan to fruition, right? And so we have to understand that. We have to understand that ultimately what? We're not God, right? We're not God. And so things in our mind and our thoughts that we think like, oh, God, why wouldn't you do this? This makes sense, right? Like this is so plain and clear. Why aren't you doing anything? But again, we have to check our pride and recognize in humility, we're not God, right? And so he ultimately has his plan where he is perfectly holy. He is perfectly good, right? And loving, but he's also perfectly wise to where he knows the best way to accomplish his purposes, right? He's not making mistakes, right? Like he knows the best way and he is moving down that path, right? And so we need to humbly recognize that sometimes God's plan is different from ours, okay? And we need to be careful of just assuming that when we are praying for something or wanting to see something, that means that God isn't working. Okay, we need to be careful about that because so many times, and I mean, you guys are maybe young enough now that you haven't really encountered this too much, but maybe you already have, where you can even have times in your life where you can ask and wonder, God, what are you doing? Like, why aren't you doing anything? And then like years down the road, you can look back on that time and think, I know exactly, like, I know what God was doing. Like he was working this, and I'm so glad he did. I'm so glad he didn't give me this when I was asking for it at that time, because later something else happened, right? Like, and so we can sometimes have that where we see down the road, when we look back, we can see how God was working in a situation, right? But the reality is sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't. And sometimes we might never really understand it till maybe like we're in heaven, right? Like, and we can look back and see, and maybe given that understanding to see how God was working, right? And so we have to understand, we have to humble ourselves to realize we're not God. And so his plans, his ways are higher than our ways and our plans, right? And to submit to that fact, okay? But let's get back to Habakkuk, right? Let's see his responses again. This is something that probably he was not expecting. So then let's look at Habakkuk's follow-up question to this, all right? Picking up in verse 12, and we'll go through verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them for reproof. You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? I will take my stand in my watchpost and station myself on the tower, and look out to see what he will say to me, and what I will answer concerning my complaint." All right. So essentially, right, if we want to summarize Habakkuk's follow-up question, his second question is, how can you use a more wicked people, right? Essentially, right, this is the flow of thought here, right? Habakkuk sees the sin of the nation, asks, why aren't you doing anything, God? God says, oh, don't worry, I'm raising up the Chaldeans. And he talks even about they are like a wicked people, right? Like they are fierce people and all that. And then Habakkuk responds, wait a second, right? Like, how can you use an even more wicked people, right? Like, we're bad, but we're not as bad as them, right? We're not as bad as the Chaldeans. We're not as sinful as them. How can you use them to like wipe us out, right? Like, they're sinful themselves, right? And we see, right? And he talks about like, he talks about just how fierce and bad like the Chaldeans are, right? Like he talks about them being like fishermen, right? And like all the other nations are just simply like fish in the ocean that are just there to like be caught by the fishermen, right? Like, and then he says, like, so they catch all these fish, right? They destroy all these nations, and then they turn and then they like praise their net, right? Like, they offer sacrifices to their net for catching these fish, and kind of that imagery is like the Babylonians like praise and worship their own military might, right? It's like they attribute all of this just to their might. And so Habakkuk's like, God, like, why? How can you use these people who are doing this not because they're like, oh, we're serving the Lord? It's because they're just saying like, we're super strong, right? We're awesome, and we're just conquering everyone, and we can do whatever we want, right? And so Habakkuk's asking, how can you use them? How can you do this, right? How can you, who, like it says, are of pure eyes, right, than to see evil and cannot look at wrong? Like, how can you remain silent when it says the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he, right? Like, we're at least better than them. And so how can you use them to bring us into exile, to bring this judgment, right? And so we can ask that same question, right? Like that even Habakkuk asked, where we can ask that question of the Lord, like, Lord, how can you do this? Right? Lord, how can you do this? And we can question some of God's ways, right? And really question what he is doing when we kind of have that answer to our prayer of, hey, you aren't doing anything. And then we find out, oh, God is doing something, but it's not what I expect. And we can ask, oh, God, why are you doing that? Right? Why are you doing that? And we see here, like at the beginning of chapter 2, verse 1, we see as Habakkuk answers this, that he also is determined to wait patiently for the Lord's answer, right? He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me. Okay, that he is waiting. He asks the Lord, how can you do this? And he says, and I'm going to wait, and I'm going to wait on the Lord's answer. Okay, and that's a lot of times what we need to do as well, right? Is to wait on the Lord and trust him, right? Like to pray, to ask, but then to be willing to wait for an answer, right? Like, and we might not always get it, like, and we're not going to be like in Habakkuk where we might not have like an audible answer from heaven, right? We're not going to have that. But a lot of times, God can show you stuff through his word, right? That kind of answers your questions, answers your grievance of something, and he can open your eyes to see the truth of what he is doing, right? And so, but we need to be faithful to wait on the Lord, to be patient, right? To not just, just be impatient and just kind of demanding of God, answer me, right? Like, it's like, no, like, seek the Lord, but be patient, right? And I think he will be faithful to answer in some extent, right? Like, again, you might not fully get an answer this side of heaven, right? But we need to wait patiently, kind of like Habakkuk was doing, all right? So that's where we're at, right? Habakkuk now asked, like, how can you use this this people who are more wicked than us, right? And then we see the Lord's answer to this, right? That goes through the rest of chapter 2. And so kind of a long section here. So bear with me as we go through this, all right? Starting in verse 2 of chapter 2. And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Moreover, wine is a traitor, an arrogant man who is never at rest. His greed is as wide as Sheol, like death. He has never enough. He gathers for himself all nations and collects as his own all peoples. Shall not all these take up their taunt against him, with scoffing and riddles for him, and say, woe to him who heaps up what is not his own, for how long, and loads himself with pledges? Will not your debtors suddenly arise, and those awake who will make you tremble? Then you will be spoil for them, because you have plundered many nations. All the remnant of the people shall plunder you, for the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to set his nest on high, to be safe from the reach of harm. You have devised shame for your house by cutting off many peoples. You have forfeited your life, for the stone will cry out from the wall, and the beam from the woodwork respond. Woe to him who builds a town with blood and founds a city on iniquity. Behold, it is not from the Lord of hosts that peoples labor merely for fire, and nations weary themselves for nothing. For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, as waters cover the sea. Woe to him who makes his neighbors drink. You pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come upon you, and utter shame will come upon your glory. The violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, as will the destruction of the beasts that terrified them. For the blood of man and violence to the earth, to cities and all who dwell in them. What profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all in it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. All right, so a little long section there, right? A little longer section to work through, right? But we see the Lord's answer, right, to Habakkuk's question, right? Like, how can you use a more wicked people than us, right? Like, how does that work? And the Lord's answer is, they will be judged too. They will be judged too. And really, like, you can even paraphrase it more of like, they won't get away with it, right? And this is where you can ask, well, like, aren't they the Lord's instrument? So how does that work, right? Like, even though the Lord is raising them up and using them as his instrument, right? Like, they're still responsible in the sense of like they don't give the glory, like we just talked about, to the Lord. They give the glory to themselves, right? They worship themselves. They worship these idols. Even in this passage, you see, like, even though they're taking over people, they're doing so in a fierce and ungodly way, right? Where they are really wicked and sinning, and they're conquering of peoples, right? Like, and how they treat the people they are conquering in different things, right? And so they are guilty. They are prideful and they are guilty, right? And as a result, they will be judged too, right? Like, it talks about that the cup, like the Lord's cup of judgment is in the Lord's right hand, right? And it will come around to you, right? Like, they think, Babylon thinks, the Chaldeans think, as they kind of just go through that, it's like, we're just super awesome. We're super strong. We can wipe out anyone we want and everything's going to be fine. Nothing can come back on us. Nothing can harm us. And the Lord's answer is, it's going to come around to you, right? Like, that judgment's going to come around to you, right? Like, it's going to come because of their pride, their greed, their violence, their wickedness, right? Like, they will also be destroyed. And so Habakkuk, you wonder, like, how can I use these people? Yes, they're going to accomplish my purpose, but guess what? Like, they're going to have to answer for their actions as well. They won't get away with their wickedness. They'll still have to pay for their wickedness, right? And so we see the Lord again answering, like, I've got this, right? And I love how this ends, right? I love how this ends, this section where you have the Lord kind of talking about the kind of uselessness of idols and all that. But then look at verse 20 where it says, but the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Right? Essentially, it's like, hey, all this is going on, Habakkuk, but guess what? I'm still in my holy temple, right? I'm still there. I've got this, right? I've got this. Don't you worry. I've got this. Okay? I am a just God. I'm going to work in a way that is just. Okay? I got this. Trust me. Okay? And that leads into this last chapter. All right? The last chapter, the last section where, if you remember from the outline, after these kind of Q&As, we then see Habakkuk's kind of final response, right? Which is actually a prayer. Okay? Habakkuk's prayer. a prayer of embracing God's sovereignty and God's will. Okay, that's really his prayer at the end here. And so we're going to divide it up a little bit. So I'll just make some notes as we're reading through, all right? So picking up in chapter 3, it says, just look at the two verses real quick. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, according to Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Real quick, so essentially, Habakkuk's prayer starts with, like, I've heard the report of you and of your work, right? Like, I've heard of what you've done in the past, right? I've heard of what you've done, and so I know you will act, like, repeat those same saving works you have done in the past, right? You have intervened in Israel's history before, and I ask, yes, do it again, okay? And then picking up verse 3. God came from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand, and there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. He stood and measured the earth. He looked and shook the nations. Then the eternal mountains were scattered. The everlasting hills sank low. His were the everlasting ways. I saw the tents of Cushan in affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian did tremble. Was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers, or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses, on your chariot of salvation? You stripped the sheath from your bow, calling for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The raging waters swept on. The deep gave forth its voice. It lifted its hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. You marched through the earth in fury. You threshed the nations in anger. You went out for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked, laying him bare from thigh to neck. You pierced with his own arrows the heads of his warriors, who came like a whirlwind to scatter me, rejoicing as if to devour the poor in secret. You trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. Okay, and we'll stop there for a second, okay? And so really, what that is, right, like Habakkuk then has like these visions of the Lord's deliverance, okay? And really, we see, again, like he prays, like, yes, Lord, do what you've done in the past. And then he like sees these visions of the Lord doing that, like he's intervening, delivering his people. And there's a lot of imagery from how God has intervened in the past. And so it's, again, praying like, God, do it. And he sees this vision of it happening, right? But then we get to these last verses 16 and 19. This is where it's so good. And these are the verses that I was thinking about just addressing by themselves. But again, I think once you have the context of the whole book, it makes it even better in these verses, right? And so let's look at these verses 16 to 19. It says, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will wait quietly for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. To the choir master with stringed instruments. And so we see here kind of like the climax of all of this, right? Like Habakkuk's response to where we see this humble confidence in the Lord. Okay, where he's really embracing God's sovereignty, embracing God's will. And we see that, right? Notice in verse 16, like, I love this verse, right? Because he says, like, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rawness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me, right? Like, he understands what's about to come, right? The Lord just told him, right? Like, I'm going to deal with that wickedness, but that means, like, exile's coming. Your nation's going to be conquered, right? That's not a light or cheery thing. And Habakkuk responds as such, right? He's trembling because he understands what's coming, right? It's not going to be fun. It's not going to be enjoyable, right? It's frightening. It's terrifying, right? We can't even imagine what that would be like, of this other nation just coming and wiping you out, taking you from your land, probably killing a lot of people, right? And all these things, your loved ones, family, all that happening. Terrible. And Habakkuk trembles, right? He's like, I tremble when I hear this. My legs are shaking, right? He is afraid. But notice the second half of verse 16, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us, right? Yet I will wait on the Lord. I will wait on the Lord, right? That's essentially what it is. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to wait, right? And then even going beyond that of waiting, notice in verse 17, right, and 18, I love these, right, where it talks about it, even if the fig tree doesn't blossom, even if there's no fruit on the vines, right, essentially if all their crops fail, right, if there is no food, right, there's no cattle, there's nothing left, it's just barren wasteland, all of that, even if that happens, what does he say in verse 18? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Okay, that even in the worst and most dire of situations, circumstances, he says, I will rejoice. Right? I will rejoice. Okay? And notice what he says, right? I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation, right? His rejoicing is not in his circumstances. His rejoicing is in who? God. That's where his focus is, right? That's how even in the worst of times, you can still rejoice and have joy. It's because your joy is in who? God, right? Our joy doesn't come from our circumstances, right? Our joy doesn't come from things going well in our life. Our joy is centered in and rooted in God. And that's it, right? It's when we take our eyes off of God and try to find joy and happiness and other things in life, that's where despair comes in, right? That's where we lose hope. That's where we crumble, right? Because we're putting our hope and our joy in something that was never meant to be the source of our hope and joy. But when we stay focused on God, our Lord, the God of our salvation, when we find joy in him, that's how, in the midst of even terrible situations, right, with whatever's going on around you, whether in the nation as a whole or just in your personal life, whatever is going on, right, and all those terrible things, that's why we can still rejoice, because we rejoice in the Lord. We don't rejoice in our circumstances. We rejoice in the God of our salvation, to recognize he is still sovereign. He is still in control. He is still working, even when we don't understand it. And we can have joy there. And then something important in verse 19. God, the Lord, is my strength. And that's another way. How can we have that joy in God in those circumstances? Because God provides the strength for us to do that. God is the source of our strength. And so in those times, he will strengthen us to be able to stand up in the midst of hard times, in the midst of the most difficult, chaotic situations, to be able to hold fast, to stand strong, and find joy in our Lord. Okay, he provides the strength. It's that beautiful thing of, yes, we're called to have joy, but God is also the one who gives that joy. Okay. And so wrapping up, right, hopefully you've seen all along the way, there's so much that is applicable here for us, right? And especially the end there, where we just talk about even in the hardest of times, right? Even with all that's going on around us, our circumstances don't dictate whether we have joy or not, because our joy should always be centered on God, on the Lord. Okay, and when we do that, that is how we can have joy in all circumstances, right? That is how we can have joy when we encounter various trials or hard times in our life. That is why our joy can never be like taken away, right? Is because if it's centered in God, if it's focused on Him, nothing can shake that foundation, right? Nothing can shake that. But it's when we start finding joy and trying to find joy in other things, focusing on other things, whether that's other people or just, I don't know, things in life. When we try to then find our joy in those things are going to fail. They're going to let us down. And that's where we can lose that joy. We can lose that hope, right? But when we center it on God, when we find our joy in Him, we can rejoice in all circumstances, right? And right now, I just pray that would be our response, right? To whatever we face, like even right now, as we seek to embrace God's will. And that's really what Habakkuk comes about to, is like he's embracing God's will. He understands, like, yes, this is hard, but I'm embracing it. And that's a reality, because that's what the name Habakkuk, it means to embrace, right? And that's what Habakkuk's doing, is he's embracing God's will, right? He's asked these questions, and it's come full circle to say, all right, like, this is going to be hard, but I trust you, God. I'm going to wait on you, and I will rejoice. And that's the epitome of embracing God's will, is to a point where we can rejoice in what's happening, despite our circumstances, despite what's around us, because we're focused on rejoicing in the Lord. All right. And so hopefully that would be our response as well. And so let me pray to wrap us up here. And that'll end our lesson. All right. So Lord, I just thank you for your word. I just pray that we would be people who do trust in you and embrace your will, Lord, to trust that you are sovereign, you are ultimately wise and good and loving. And so even when we don't understand your plans, when we don't understand what you're doing, or it might even appear to us that you're not at work, help us to trust that you are at work. You are accomplishing your purposes, and let us respond with patience, with waiting on you, and also respond with embracing your will, rejoicing in times of difficulty, because we rejoice in you, Lord. And so help us stay focused, centering our joy on the right thing, which is you, not our circumstances, not the people around us, but our joy is centered on you. So help us, grant us that strength to do that, Lord. And I just pray these things in your Son's name. Amen. All right, guys. Hope you have a great rest of your Sunday, and I'll see you guys Wednesday.